जिनके हृदय श्री राम बसे, जिनके हृदय श्री राम बसे, उन और को नाम लियो न लियो। जिनके हृदय श्री राम बसे, उन और को नाम लियो न लियो। जिनके हृदय श्री राम। कोई मांगे कंचन सी काया, कोई मांग रहा प्रभु से माया। कोई मांगे कंचन सी काया, कोई मांग रहा प्रभु से माया। कोई पुण्य करे, कोई दान करे, कोई नाम का रोज बखान करे। जिन कन्या धन को दान दियो, जिन कन्या धन को दान दियो, उन और को दान दियो न दियो। जिनके हृदय श्री राम बसे, उन और को नाम लियो न लियो। जिनके हृदय श्री राम। कोई घर में बैठा नमन करे, कोई हरि मंदिर में भजन करे। कोई घर में बैठा नमन करे, कोई हरि मंदिर में भजन करे। कोई गंगा जमुना स्नान करे, कोई काशी जाके ध्यान धरे। जिन मात पिता की सेवा की, जिन मात पिता की सेवा की, उन तीर्थ स्थान कियो न कियो। जिनके हृदय श्री राम बसे, उन और को नाम लियो न लियो। जिनके हृदय श्री राम। जिनके हृदय श्री राम। जिनके हृदय श्री राम।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. Love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. You just heard from the face that is very familiar to you, the voice that is very familiar to you by now, Mithu Pal's, the beautiful Ram Bhajan. It was about having the divine. The name here used is Ram, that is not so important. Having the divine in your heart all the time means being aware of the divine all the time. And there were many others sort of examples cited of how many of the externals and minor things to which we sometimes give more importance in our spiritual practice get automatically sort of covered or become insignificant when you do something which truly goes to the heart of the issue, which truly goes to your complete sort of dedication to the divine. So whether you go to a pilgrimage or not, whether you do this or that, doesn't matter. The main thing is to be aware of the divine all the time. If it is in your heart, you'll be aware of it. If you'll be aware of it, then all that you do will be colored and controlled and guided by that awareness. That is what eventually matters. Today's session is about proteins, a topic which can sometimes lead to rather emotional sort of responses also, because of the many deeply ingrained misconceptions about how much we need, where to get it from, whether more of it is really good for us, and so on and so forth. How difficult it is to get proteins. Is malnutrition in India primarily because of protein deficiency? Will it help if we provide high protein supplements to everybody? Now, all these things, I think today's session should help in giving a little more objective view of. So with that, we go to the PowerPoint presentation. The talk today, the course, Yes.02, all this is a part of the 150th birth anniversary celebrations of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Just for recapitulation, these are the traditional nutrients. Traditional because now we know that the number of nutrients which may be present in very small quantity but are all the same important has now multiplied into hundreds. But then the major nutrients, the traditional nutrients about which we know much more and which are frequently talked about are just these 6. And today we'll focus on proteins. Proteins, the word itself comes from protos, or first. I don't know what made those who named this particular nutrient protein, because protos means first, what they had in mind, whether they really considered it to be the most important nutrient, the first nutrient to think about, or we can just say that proteins were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. And that was just good luck. But we need not go into that discussion further. Instead, let's get down to the brass tacks. The energy content of proteins is the same as that of carbohydrates, 4 calories per gram. Doesn't mean that we should be using proteins for getting energy. Invariably, we would use some protein for getting energy, but the primary fuel remains carbohydrate. And when carbohydrate is not available, then fat. Protein is the last resort. And therefore, we need in our diet the amount of protein that we need for functions other than giving energy. But all the same, even if that is what our intention is, some of the protein will get utilized for giving us energy, because all the protein that we take may not be suitable for giving us, for being converted into body tissues for growth and repair of wear and tear. But all the same, this energy content is also important from another point of view when we are trying to measure the total amount of food that a person should take in a day, or the total amount that a person has taken in a day. Then once again, one common currency sort of in which we can express that is the energy content of the meal or the food. So that's how, knowing this is important, we get from proteins the same amount of energy as from carbohydrates, that is 4 calories per gram. What are the sources of proteins? Now, this is a picture that you saw also when we were talking about carbohydrates. And there the emphasis was that carbohydrates are present not only in cereals, but also in pulses, and a lot of it is there in pulses. Around 60% of the dry weight of pulses is also carbohydrate. Today, the emphasis will be on the fact that although pulses do have more protein than cereals, cereals also have a considerable amount of protein. So 20% of the pulses is, an average pulse is protein, And an average cereal has about 10% of its weight in the form of protein. So it's 10% versus 20%. It's not that the cereals don't have protein. This is the most important thing to keep in mind, because it's a very common misconception that cereals have no protein. We get all our protein from pulses. Cereals do have a lot of protein, and quantitatively, in fact, cereals are more important than pulses because they may have only about half the quantity as compared to pulses. The amount of cereal that we take is much more than that of pulses, and that is quite right. That also we shall see why that is quite okay. And therefore, quantitatively, the contribution of cereals to our protein intake in an average Indian vegetarian diet is much more than the contribution of pulses. Now, how much protein should we take? There are two common ways in which it is expressed. One is 1 gram per kilogram body weight for an adult, which means an adult weighing 50 kilos should take about 50 grams of protein in a day. Another way to express it is as 10% of the total energy intake. So suppose as a round figure, a person needs 2000 calories in a day. Out of this 10%, that is 200 calories should come from protein. Now, if 200 calories have to come from protein, and each gram of protein gives 4 calories, then these 200 calories will come from 50 grams of protein. So if the person weighs 50 kilos, that comes to 1 gram per kilogram body weight. So expressed either way, it comes to about 50 to 60 grams of protein for a person weighing 50 to 60 kilos. Now, if we need 10% of the energy intake in the form of protein, and the major source of energy in our diet are cereals and pulses, and cereals provide 10% of that energy in the form of protein, and pulses provide 20%, a mixture of the two will easily provide more than 10% of our energy intake in the form of protein. So, it's as simple. 10% of the energy intake we need in the form of protein, and if our staple diet consists of a mixture of cereals and pulses, and the cereals provide 10% and pulses provide 20%, the mixture will easily provide more than 10% of the energy intake in the form of protein. Which means that we do not really need any other exotic source of protein for meeting our protein requirements. Our staple diet, a mixture of cereals and pulses, is quite adequate to provide us not only all the energy that we need, but also all the protein that we need. You may say, well, that may be okay for adults, but how about the children? They do need more protein. So for them, we'll have to think of some other sources of protein other than cereals and pulses. Now let's examine this by taking, say, an adult weighing 50 kilos and a child weighing 10 kilos. A child of about 2, that is about 2 years of age, weighs about 10 kilos. So here we have the adult and the child compared. The protein requirement of an adult is 1 gram per kilogram body weight, as we saw. So this 50 kilo adult will need 50 grams of protein in a day. The child's requirement is 2 grams per kilogram body weight. So here, there you are, you'll say, he needs double the amount. So the child, in spite of being just 10 kilos in weight, needs 20 grams of protein in a day. Now, if the adult does take these 50 grams will give this adult 200 calories in a day. And if the child takes these 20 grams of protein, then the proteins will provide this child 80 calories per day. Now, the total amount of calories that an adult, a 50 kilo adult takes, says 2000. And the total calories that a 10 kilo child takes is say about 1000. Now, if you see this 200 as a percentage of these 2000, that is protein calories as a percentage of the total calories that the person takes in a day, this comes to 10%. So that's what our intention was, and that's what we have seen, that a satisfactory protein intake for an adult is 10% of the energy intake. Now, what about the child? The child is getting these 80 calories when the child is getting an adequate amount of protein, that is 2 grams per kilogram body weight. This child is getting 80 calories from protein, and the total energy intake of the child is 1000. So 80 is how much of 1000? 8%, which means the child needs not even 10% of the energy intake as protein. The child needs only 8%. So on one hand, we saw that the child needs double the quantity, 1 gram per kg body weight for the adult and 2 gram per kg body weight for the child. So child needs double. Here, as a percentage of the total energy intake, the child in fact seems to need a little less, or at the most you might say about the same amount. Now, how did we get this paradox? I'm sure some of you have already figured it out, and that's what comes out in the next picture. When we say that an adult weighing 50 kilos needs 2000 calories in a day, that comes to 40 calories per kg body weight. That's the total energy intake. A 10 kilo child needs 1000 calories, that comes to 100 calories per kg body weight. So not only the protein requirement is double, 2 as compared to 1, the energy requirement is also more than double, 100 as compared to 40. And why is that necessary? Because the child runs around a lot, the child is growing, and therefore, you might have seen a 2-year-old child, how if you try to think of a 2-year-old child can't sit still for a moment, it's running around all the time. So plenty of physical activity, on top of that it is growing. And that's why as compared to an adult, it needs more than double the energy on a per kilogram body weight basis. So if the energy requirement is also more, then the percentage of energy that needs to come from protein remains more or less constant. So that is what explains this paradox, that the child also doesn't need any extra protein when we look at it in terms of the percentage of energy that should come from protein, the percentage of energy that should come from protein as a percentage of the total energy that the child should be taking. So that is more or less the same for the adult and the child. Now you'll say that, well, all that may be also okay, but how about the protein quality? Because we should take good quality protein. That's general knowledge. Yes, all proteins are not alike. They vary in their quality. And the usual comparison is between plant protein and animal protein. And it's a scientific fact that animal protein has a better quality than plant protein. And if that is so, then at least for the sake of quality, probably we'll have to take some animal protein. Now, before we come to that rather simplistic, superficial conclusion, let's examine this a little more in detail. And the detail will be in terms of going a bit into the chemistry of proteins. I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. And if you understand it, fine. If you don't, then you can just feel happy that I failed in simplifying it enough. So you can celebrate my failure rather than really suffer from any handicap. Now, the basic building blocks of proteins are amino acids. So say this is a dietary protein, and this triangles, squares, and circles, and all these represent individual amino acids which have been strung together to form a protein which is a part of our diet. So this is the dietary protein. What happens in the process of digestion is that these amino acids, this protein is broken up into its constituent units, and these are the individual amino acids that we get. Then, when it gets into the blood and it reaches the tissues where the proteins have to be manufactured for either growth or repair of wear and tear, that we may call utilization, we get a human protein. Now, what has happened is that these amino acids have been rearranged in a different way to form human protein. Like a child may make one type of structure using building blocks and then may demolish that and then build another type of structure using the same blocks. But then here you notice something odd, and that is, this is a type of unit which was not there in our dietary protein, but it has entered the human protein. Now, this is an amino acid which probably was not there in the dietary protein, but the body itself has manufactured. So the body is capable of manufacturing many amino acids, and that it manufactures as and when necessary. So this is how we get dietary protein, break it down, and then utilize it to form these proteins which are a part of our body. Now, let's keeping this in mind, look at a few important facts. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Although there are about 500 amino acids known to chemists, only about 20 amino acids form human protein. And a single protein molecule may have thousands of amino acids. And therefore, the variety of proteins is also almost infinite. Now, you can understand it like this. We have only 26 letters of the alphabet. And words having more than 10 letters are rather rare. And yet you have thousands of words giving you a whole dictionary of words. Here we have 20 amino acids, just a little less than 26. But then the number that can be present in each protein can go to thousands. And therefore, the variety of proteins that we can have is almost infinite. Then what happens is that the amino acids have a particular sequence. Different amino acids come in a different sequence in each protein, and the sequence determines the shape and some other properties of the protein, like charge, etc. Because once they start stringing, these thousands of proteins don't remain just as one long string. They start folding up and may form some sort of a fibrous structure or a globular structure, but they fold up quite a bit, and that's what gives the protein molecule a shape. What is a protein molecule? Molecule, is that smallest entity that still has the properties of the protein. If you break it any further, it will not behave as that protein anymore. It is too small for that. So the smallest unit that still has the properties of that protein is the molecule. So this protein molecule may have thousands of amino acids, and the sequence in which these different amino acids have been strung together determine how it will fold up and acquire a particular shape. And the shape is important in case of proteins because shape and some other properties like the electrical charge, etc., is what determines the way a protein functions. For example, suppose a protein is an antibody to an antigen. These days after COVID, everybody understands a bit about antigens and antibodies. So suppose a protein is an antibody to an antigen found in COVID. Now, this antigen and antibody fit each other like a lock and key. And that's how the antibody is able to perform its function. Now, to be able to fit like a lock and key, their shapes have to be complementary, which means that the shape of the protein is important. So that's why the shape is important. And that is why the body is very fussy about a specific amino acid that it needs when it's manufacturing a protein. So the body is very fussy about the amino acids it uses for manufacturing a specific protein. If a particular amino acid is missing, the chain will stop there. It will not get prolonged further till that amino acid becomes available. But then we may not have all the amino acids in exactly the same proportion in which we need them. So any leftover amino acids can be used for giving energy. And that's why some amino acids do end up giving us just energy. And an amino acid is not available, on the other hand, may get synthesized. So some are leftovers, some get leftover, and some are missing, and they get synthesized, missing or are in short supply. But then there are 9 amino acids out of these 20, which means almost half. 9 amino acids out of these 20, which the body cannot synthesize. The body cannot manufacture on its own. These are called the essential amino acids. And because the body cannot manufacture them, they must come from the diet. Not only they must come from the diet, they should come in the proportion in which they are needed. Now, to understand this proportion part, let's look at the next picture. Say this is a plant protein and this is an animal protein. Both have a large number of amino acids strung together. And just to sort of give a visual impression of the plant protein and the animal protein, I have shown a preponderance of green colored amino acids in the plant protein and the red colored amino acids in the animal protein. And the amino acids which the body cannot manufacture I've shown through these with these slanting lines. So this particular type of green amino acid and this type of red amino acid are essential amino acids. The body can't manufacture them. Now look at the proportion. In the plant protein, you have these 2 green amino acids for each 1 molecule of this red colored amino acid. So the ratio of red to green is 1:2. And look at the plant protein, 3 of these red ones and only 1 green one. So now, if a person takes only this type of a plant protein and wants to manufacture this type of a protein, then what will happen is that the person will use up whatever this green essential amino acid is, and a lot will be left surplus. But when it comes to the red one, it will face a shortage because the proportion is very different from that in the animal protein. One solution could be that the person takes so much of this plant protein that even from this plant protein, the person can get as much of this red essential amino acid as is necessary. It doesn't matter if a lot of other amino acids are then left surplus. They can be used for getting energy. But then that would mean that 1 gram per kilogram body weight protein will not be enough. Then the person might have to take 5 grams per kilogram body weight of protein if the person has to get it only from this plant protein. So instead of 50 grams of protein in a day, the person might need 250 grams of protein in a day to get all these amino acids. But then can there be another solution? One solution you say can be to take animal protein itself, because we are basically animals, so our proteins are more similar to animal protein, be it from milk or meat, from meat or fish. Our proteins are more similar to animal protein, so the proportion of essential amino acids will be similar to the one which we need for manufacturing our protein. So one solution is to take animal protein. Is there any other solution? Yes, fortunately there is, because all plant proteins are not alike. We may be able to find another plant protein in which this green essential amino acid does not exist. Whereas you have corresponding to this in the same amount of protein, 5 molecules of this red essential amino acid. So 5 plus 1 gives you 6, and 2 come from here. So the ratio again becomes 1:3. So if you take these two proteins in equal quantity, then what would happen is we will end up getting these green to red ones in the ratio of 1:3, which is exactly the ratio which is required for manufacturing our protein. Do such complementary proteins exist? Do we have such plant proteins in which the deficiency of one is made up by the other? Yes, fortunately they do. And you might again guess which are those complementary proteins. Those complementary proteins are the cereal and pulse proteins. Cereals are deficient in lysine, which is an essential amino acid, and pulses lack in methionine. So they lack in 2 different essential amino acids. So if we combine the two, the lysine deficiency of cereals is made up by the pulses, and the methionine deficiency of pulses is made up by the cereals, and the two together give us a good quality protein. What is the ratio in which we should mix cereals and pulses to get a good quality protein? 5:1, which means about 5 parts of cereal as compared to 1 part of pulse. Which means if a person takes 500 grams of cereal in a day and 100 grams of a dal, a pulse or a legume, then the two together will give him 600 grams of grains. 600 grams of grain translates into about 1800 calories, because most of these grains have about 300 calories per gram. So 1800 is about the energy requirement, which means much of the energy requirement will be then met from this mixture of cereals and pulses. 500 grams of cereal, 100 grams of pulses, together 600 grams, 1800 calories, and the cereals will provide him, if he takes 500 grams of cereals, 10%, 50 grams of protein. Pulses, 100 grams of pulses, 20 grams of protein. So 50 comes from here, 20 comes from the person gets 70 grams of protein. A very generous allowance for a 50 or 60 kilogram person. So 500 grams of cereal plus 100 grams of pulse will give him about 70 grams of protein, 70 grams of protein, and in a way that they complement each other, and he gets a good quality 70 grams of protein in a day. Now, this knowledge is both old and new. The new part is that these experiments were done sometime in the 1930s and 40s at the National Institute of Nutrition. That's what it is called now. Those days it was called the Nutrition Research Laboratories. And it was not in Hyderabad as it is now, it was in Kunur. That is where these experiments were done. And they had these rats which were given either animal protein coming from milk, or they were given different types of mixtures like dal and roti, moong ki dal, and wheat, which is more common in the north, and rice and sambar, the way it is taken in the south. And they found that these rats which were given this mixture, cereal and pulse mixture, grew just as well as the animals which were given milk protein. This is new, but then this knowledge is not really new, because if you see, not only in India, rice and sambar and roti and dal are the staple diet in much of the country. In China, the staple diet is rice and soybean, and in Latin American countries, corn and beans. These are all cereal pulse mixtures. So this time-tested knowledge, which all ancient civilizations seem to have learned, probably by trial and error, and we keep rediscovering it again and again. Now, whether this protein was born with a silver spoon in its mouth or not is debatable, but then for a long time, it ended up being the king of nutrients. The king has been dethroned now, but as Robert Louis Stevenson says, vanity dies hard. In some obstinate cases, it outlives the man. So proteins continue to have that vanity, and many of us continue to support it and treat proteins as the king of nutrients. Now, let's see how it got, how it came to be the king, what was the coronation, and then how it got dethroned. How it got dethroned, much of it we have discussed, but then the coronation is also important. And one way of looking at it is that it happened after this extremely compassionate and competent doctor, Dr. Cicely Williams, a Jamaican pediatrician, but educated in England. And when she went back to Jamaica for her practice, she observed that there was a very large number of children with pot bellies, kwashiorkor. The disease is called kwashiorkor. And then through astute observations, she figured out that it was because of protein deficiency, which was absolutely right. When there's a person has protein deficiency, when a child has protein deficiency, then with less of protein circulating in the blood, the osmotic pressure of the blood falls, the fluid leaks out of the blood vessels, and that's what collects in the abdomen, and that's what gives the child a pot belly. So these children with pot belly had protein deficiency. But then she said, why is it so? Because these women were feeding either a starchy gruel to the children, or they were trying to give bottle feed, or a mixture of the two. Now, why were the women doing it? Because there was a lot of advertising by the baby food manufacturers saying that breastfeeding is now obsolete, out of date, and doesn't give enough to the child. So instead of breastfeeding, you feed this milk powder to the child. Now, these women were poor women, and they couldn't afford the quantity that was being recommended by these baby food manufacturers. So what they would do is they would try to dilute it as much as possible. So they were giving extremely dilute milk powder to these children and supplementing it with a starchy gruel, because that is what they were accustomed to. Cassava, the roots which are primarily starch with very little protein. So the milk was not able to give protein because the quantity was not enough. And the gruel was not giving any protein because the gruel didn't have any protein in it. It was made from a starchy root. And the result was the child had acute protein deficiency. And on top of that, the feed that they were making, they would make once and sometimes keep it for a long time. And they didn't have a refrigerator to keep it. It will get warm and get spoiled. That happened a lot in African countries, particularly. So very hot countries. And it happened a lot there. Now, the result is that as a result of giving this dilute, infected milk, the child gets diarrhea. When the child gets diarrhea, the child loses more. Already the child is not getting enough. On the other hand, the child is losing more in stool and in vomiting. And therefore, that makes the child further undernourished. And when the child is undernourished, its immunity levels go down. And therefore, its chances of getting not only diarrhea, but also respiratory infections and other common infections goes up. And when the these infections come, the child gets further diarrhea and vomiting, which means the child gets further malnourished. The immunity levels go down further. It becomes a vicious cycle. Malnutrition leading to reduced immunity leading to infections, infection leading to further malnutrition. And that was the type of things that began with Dr. Cicely Williams. And she's very well, she got many awards and honors, very richly deserved. And she did a great service to medical science by describing kwashiorkor and making us aware of what we should be doing. And she was one of those, who once again sort of made us conscious that breastfeeding is far better than giving this dilute dilute powdered milk. But all the same, because she just said that protein is important, the industry capitalized on it. And they started coming up with all types of protein supplements and high protein foods like soybean and this and that. And they made combinations like CSM, corn, soya milk and whatnot. They came up with all types of tricks which could be commercialized to say that, well, Dr. Cecily Williams has shown that protein is extremely important for children. And therefore, here we are. If you give this to the child, your child will never get protein deficient. But then was it really relevant in every situation? Particularly, say, if we look at India. Breastfeeding has been common. Even in those countries, African countries, where this problem was seen a lot, even they, how did they traditionally survive? Because this was a recent phenomenon, kwashiorkor and giving this bottled milk, this was a recent phenomenon. How did they survive for thousands of years? They survived for thousands of years because although their supplement that they gave to the child was the starchy gruel, they continued to give breast milk to the child up to the age of 5 years. African women continued to feed children, breastfeed the child till the age of 5. And after 5, in any case, the child is grown up enough to eat everything that the adult eats, including meat, and therefore the child would never get protein deficient. That's how they survived for all these thousands of years. But then here, early in life, at the age of 6 months, this child was ready for a top feed in addition to milk. The milk that it was getting was an infected, dilute milk, and the top feed that it was getting was a starchy gruel, and that is what gave kwashiorkor. But instead, what would be better is to continue breastfeeding, if not for 5 years, at least 1.5, 2 years. And when at 6 months the child is ready for a semi-solid food, the best semi-solid food is probably khichdi, a combination of cereal and pulse. It will more than meet the requirements of the child, both in terms of energy as well as protein. Not only protein quantity, but also the quality of protein. And therefore, the general dictum, which is a simple solution that works, but does not suit many vested interests. The simple solutions are breastfeeding, semi-solids like khichdi, and this simple mathematics is if the quantity of all this that you are giving, breastfeed and the khichdi, is insufficient, protein will also be insufficient. But if the quantity is sufficient, the protein will be sufficient. So the solution is give enough food. Give enough food in forms that are traditional, locally available, and culturally acceptable. That's the solution. So the dethroning is based on this dictum, which we have known once for the last at least 40, 50 years. If the energy content of a cereal pulse mixture is enough, protein intake will take care of itself. This is what so many nutritionists who have no axe to grind have been saying for the last at least 50 years. Cecily Williams, she described kwashiorkor in 1933, which means about 70, 80 years ago. But then for the last 50 years, 30 years or so, there was some misunderstanding about whether protein truly is the king or not. But for the last 50 years, there has been no doubt at all. Protein doesn't deserve that place of pride. If the energy content of a cereal pulse mixture is enough, protein intake will take care of itself. We'll get enough protein in terms of quantity. We'll get good quality protein. So the quantity and quality of the protein will take care of itself if the energy content of a cereal pulse mixture is enough. And this holds true for children as much as it does for adults. Okay. So instead of saying proteins first, as the name suggests, we should probably be saying energy first, and then a judicious selection of food next. Protein will take care of itself. But then what keeps this king alive? Now here is an advertisement from a manufacturer of a popular protein supplement. And what does this advertisement say? To meet our daily protein needs with almonds, you would need 300 grams of these almonds per day. Believable? Then they are giving you the mathematics that 100 grams of these almonds have 20 grams of protein. So if you take 300 grams, you'll get 60 grams of protein. That is the amount of protein you need. So if you want all your daily protein requirement, that is 60 grams from these almonds, you'll have to take 300 grams of these almonds. And since you cannot take these 300, instead of taking these 300 grams of almonds, you take this protein supplement. Now see how logic can be twisted. Where are all the cereals and pulses gone? Why would anybody want to take all the protein from these almonds? What will happen to all the fat that these almonds have, and increase the total caloric intake of the person, even if the person can afford this much of almonds in a day? How much will be the caloric content of these 300 grams? Will he get everything that the person needs just from this and take nothing else throughout the day? These are questions that they don't go into. They just tell you 20 grams for in each 100 grams, you need 60 grams of protein. So take 300 grams to get enough protein. Since you will not be able to do it, take this protein supplement. Another advertisement from the same manufacturer. Either 10 eggs per day or else you'll be protein deficient. I can meet my protein needs eggs alone, myth or fact, and then telling you that yes, it is possible, but again, it will be very difficult. One egg gives you about 6 grams of protein, 10 eggs will give you 60 grams of protein. So it is possible to get 60 grams from 10 eggs, but since you will not be able to take 10 eggs every day, might as well take this protein supplement. And they claim that the protein supplement has behind it 50 years of trust. This brand has been trusted for 50 years. That's what they claim. What about those thousands of years of trust that mankind has placed in cereal pulse mixtures? What is 50 years as compared to those thousands of years? But then they tout that our supplement has been trusted by the world for the last 50 years. So instead of getting protein deficient because you cannot take 10 eggs a day, because you can't take 300 almonds a day, please take this protein supplement. These are the people who keep the protein myth alive. That's what prevents the king from getting displaced from its throne. Another advertisement from the manufacturers of not a protein supplement, but those who are trying to sell these nuts of different types. And they're telling you it is a complete protein. I don't know what complete really means. A protein which has all the essential amino acids in the proportion in which we need them may be called complete, but then we don't need these nuts to get complete protein. A cereal pulse mixture can do the job much more easily. That's how the world has been doing for thousands of years. Now let's come to some questions. Can too much protein in the diet be harmful? You may ask that, okay, all this is okay, but suppose I be on the cautious side. I take a cereal pulse mixture. I also take a protein supplement. I also take milk. I also take meat. I also take egg. I also take all these things, fish. So the quantity of protein in my diet may be much more than I need. Will it do any harm? So long as the total caloric intake remains about 2000 or whatever I need, probably it should be okay. But it seems it is not really okay. And here are some of the harmful effects, some directly because of the protein and some indirectly. Now, the different types of harmful effects of excessive protein in the diet can be firstly kidney disease, because if we take too much of protein, as we saw, it will get utilized for giving us energy. And when it gives us energy, it does not get metabolized to the level of carbon dioxide and water the way carbohydrates and fats do. Proteins get metabolized only up to the level of urea. And this urea then has to be excreted by the kidneys. And that is how the kidney disease, the risk for kidney disease goes up. And the two major problems which may arise are stones and reduction in renal function, which may be shown by the glomerular filtration rate or creatinine levels and so on. Calcium deficiency, because too much of protein increases the calcium levels in the urine. We start losing more calcium from the body. So calcium deficiency may be precipitated by too much of protein in the diet. Then things like headache, indigestion and all, they happen because invariably the protein content is increased by increasing the amount of animal protein. And this animal protein then gets fermented. Whatever is not digested gets fermented, and some will not get digested. Some indigestible or undigested residue will remain. That leads to fermentation by the germs in the large intestine, and that's what gives this headache, indigestion, bloating of the abdomen, and so on. Then, again, many of these foods of animal origin also have a large amount of saturated fat, and therefore the risk for heart disease may go up, not because of the protein, but indirectly because these sources of protein like red meat may have these sources like red meat would have a large amount of saturated fat, and that is what increases the risk for heart disease. Then again, the fermentation products of some of the meats give us things like nitrosamines, which increase the risk for colonic cancer. And then many of these metabolites have to be detoxified by the liver, and that may derange the liver function. So indirectly, you can see because of protein itself or because of the animal food from which we may try to take this extra protein, we can get a very large variety of side effects. You might say that, well, you have just collected them from here and there because you wanted to emphasize vegetarian diets, but here is a reference also available to you from the National Institutes of Health. And here is another study, prestigious study available, where some details of the study are also given. Not just a few, but almost 7,000 middle-aged people aged in the age group of 50 to 65 who were reported eating a high-protein diet with more than 20% of their energy intake coming from protein instead of the 10%, which is the requirement. They were 4 times more likely to die of cancer or diabetes, nearly twice as likely to die from any cause, that is all-cause mortality, in the following 18 years, that is 18 years after the study started. It is apparently an 18-year follow-up. They are very difficult, laborious studies. These effects were either abolished or reduced in individuals eating a high-protein diet that was mainly plant-based. So some of the effects are not because of the protein itself, but indirect because of the sources from which the protein comes. Therefore, even if the person was taking about 20% of the energy intake in the form of protein, but this protein was coming from plant sources, then many of these adverse effects were either abolished or reduced, which means it's partly the fault of the protein, partly the source from where we tend to get this extra protein. Now, how about going vegetarian? I myself went vegetarian only at the age of 45. So it is possible to go vegetarian, and a lot of people in the world are today doing so. And why are they doing it? Primarily for 3 reasons. One is for health reasons, which we have seen, that how animal foods can be harmful. And we find that incidentally, all the harmful elements, such as saturated fat or the fermentation leading to formation of bile stones and nitrosamines leading to cancers and so on, they are all found in animal foods. Whereas all the protective factors like dietary fiber and other phytochemicals, which we will talk about in one of the subsequent sessions, all these protective factors which protect us from not only heart disease and diabetes, but also from cancer and a variety of other problems because of their antioxidant effect. All these protective factors are found in plants. So all the harmful ones in animal foods, all the protective ones in plant foods. Ethics. Now, sometimes religion enters here. My religion allows me to take meat. But then the other side of it is no religion compels a person to take meat. Not only that, no religion stops a person from giving up meat. If a person's religion allows meat and he has been taking meat, then no religion stops him from giving it up. Probably there's only one religion in which meat is absolutely not allowed, and that is Jainism, which means all other religions in the world to some extent allow meat, at least certain types of meat. And therefore, religion is not the major problem. It may allow it, but no religion compels a person to take meat, and no religion stops a person from giving up meat. Now, here I might cite an anecdote. In the year January 1993, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences organized a conference on the relationship between vegetarian diets and cancer. And in fact, that is what made me turn vegetarian, because I was asked to speak in the conference and I thought I had no moral right to speak in that conference if I was myself a non-vegetarian. So that's when I gave up, a few weeks before I spoke in the conference. Now, the chief guest in that conference, in the valedictory function, was Dr. L.M. Singhvi, a noted person from the judiciary, but also a diplomat. He was the High Commissioner of India in the UK for some time. He had studied law in England, and during his valedictory speech, he cited an anecdote from his youth. When as a young boy he was studying law in England, one day he heard a knock on his apartment early in the morning. And on opening the door, he found that there was a middle-aged British couple there. who asked whether they could come in. Naturally, you'd say, welcome, please come in, have your seat. They came in and they looking rather sad. They said, our only child has committed suicide. And in the suicide note, it has said, he has said that if eating meat is necessary to stay alive, I do not want to live. Now, those days in England and in much of Europe, the misconception was that one man cannot live only on plant food. One must have some meat to be able to live. So considered essential for survival. And the boy had picked this up from the surroundings and come to the conclusion that if eating meat is necessary to stay alive, I don't want to live. And that's how he had taken this drastic step of committing suicide. And as a tribute to this child, his parents wanted to give up meat, but they didn't know how to cook vegetarian food. So they asked this person, L.M. Singhvi, Lakshmi Mal Singhvi, we have heard that you are a vegetarian. Please, can you teach us how to make some vegetarian food? So that is why they had come to him. So religion has nothing to do with it. Here was a boy, a very sensitive boy, born a Christian, but then taking this drastic step. This misconception has now disappeared in much of the world. Nobody believes that eating meat is essential to live. But it lives partially that to be strong, it is essential to have meat. If you don't take meat, at least you'll be weak. You may live, but you will be weak. Even that is not true. As you can see, at least there's nothing supporting it in all the facts that you have heard today. And of course, not perfectly logical, seemingly logical. People say, well, elephants don't take meat and they are so strong. Rhinos don't take meat and they are so strong. This is logic, rather superficial and perverted logic, but all the same, it is logic. But not for those reasons, not because we want to compare ourselves to elephants and monkeys and rhinos, but even otherwise, there is nothing really supporting the idea that non-vegetarian food is essential for being strong. Then third important reason, which carries a lot of weight and many people think this is worth listening to, and that is the ecological reasons. Now, the ecological reason is twofold. One is in relation to the amount of agricultural land that we use for growing the grass, which the animals will eat before we kill them. When one might say, well, that should not be a major consideration because the animals are in any case there and they are in any case having the grass. We are just killing some of them. But that is not really true in countries where meat is consumed in large amounts, where that is more or less the staple diet. Their meat industry is a well-organized industry, and they own large plots of land on which grass is grown, on which they grow these animals, make them graze, and then make them grow in weight as fast as possible by giving drugs, etc. And the result is that the animal fattens, grows, even if that bulk that the animal builds up may not be made of fat, it may be made up of water, that apart. But anyway, so the animal looks bulky and is now ready to be killed. So they breed animals, they grow animals, and then they kill animals. So even before the animal has been born, it is known that the next baby that this cow will have is destined to die. And to keep this industry running, more than 90% of the agricultural land in the US is used for growing grass for animals destined to die. You'll say, but at least we are getting food from it. If we use it as agricultural land, still we'll get food. If we get animals, still we get food. But it's not as simple as that, because to get 1 kilo of animal protein, we have to use up about 30 kilos of plant protein, because the animal eats for many years before it is killed. And therefore, the conversion is extremely inefficient. Conversion from plant protein to animal protein is extremely inefficient, which means that if instead of breeding, making these animals grow on this grass, this land were to be spared for growing the type of food that human beings can directly eat, much of the problem of world hunger will disappear in one stroke. The second important ecological reason is the carbon footprints. That happens because the industry in which the animals are killed, then packed, stored, transported, kept in cold storage for long periods, all these things consume energy. And all this leaves carbon footprints. And therefore, it also contributes to global warming. And again, the contribution of meat industry to global warming is phenomenal. A UN report published in the year 2006 estimated that the contribution of meat industry to global warming exceeds that of all the SUVs, ships, and aeroplanes of the world put together. So that is the scale, which means that once again, if the world were to go vegetarian, not only the problem of world hunger, but also the problem of global warming can be solved in one stroke. Now, with that much of a little dispassionate, fact-based, but all the same passionate plea for turning vegetarian, let's turn to a high-protein pulse, soybean. What is special about soybean? Again, it was during that period when industry started, looking for ways of telling people protein is important for you. You can't get enough of it from an ordinary diet. And therefore, here are the high protein foods that we have for you. So all types of soybean preparations in different forms came up. And soybean was being promoted as a miracle food. A lot of research was also done around it to show that not only it has protein, it helps in preventing heart disease, it helps in preventing diabetes, and so on and so forth. Well, much of that in research is true. But what we forget is that truth becomes misguiding if you get to know only part of the truth. Yes, soybean helps in preventing heart disease and diabetes, but soybean is not the only food. It's not only the food factor that helps in preventing diabetes and heart disease. The same thing would be said by somebody who is manufacturing tea or coffee. And you have seen that type of advertisements also, that this tea, particularly green tea, helps in preventing diabetes and heart disease and cancer. No, they're all speaking the truth, but they're giving only part of the truth, emphasizing only the food that they manufacture and ignoring all other foods. But anyway, let's see what soybean is in a dispassionate manner. It is a pulse with a difference. We saw that most of the pulses have about 60% carbohydrate, 20% protein, and 20% and negligible amount of fat. Here is a pulse in which the carbohydrate content is only about 20%, protein is 40%, double as compared to the other dals and pulses. Fat 20%, which other pulses don't have. And that is why we can get soybean oil. You can extract oil from soybean and get soybean oil. And now this fat has the uniqueness of having N3-POFA. It's one of the very few vegetable oils. When we come to fats the next time, day after tomorrow, we'll talk about this. So right now, don't try to, if you don't understand, doesn't matter what this is, but this is an essential component of fat. And the only vegetable oils that provide us are either soybean oil or mustard oil and its close relatives like canola. So, but anyway, so this is again, emphasized a lot by someone who may be like trying to promote soybean, that it contains N3-POFA. But then if that is what you're interested in, why not take soybean oil instead of taking soybean? And what is the advantage in taking this 40% protein? We don't need that much. When a ordinary cereal pulse mixture can give us more than the 10% that we need, why do we have to add a pulse containing 40%? But all the same, soybean is an acceptable food, but it's not a miracle food. That's what we have to remember. I'm not saying never take soybean. Take soybean by all means. It's a perfectly acceptable food, but it's not a miracle food which will do wonders, which will make up our protein deficiency, which will protect us from diabetes and cancer and heart disease, and it will the only source of N3-POFA and so on. You can build up a whole list of properties which soybean has to promote soybean. But the fact remains that no single food is a miracle food. Miracle foods don't exist. The dictum is a judicious variety of food gives you a good balanced diet. So variety part is important. Of course, not just any variety, a judiciously chosen variety, but that is what gives us a balanced diet, not a single food which may be a miracle food. Miracle foods don't exist. Now let's come to some other questions, which may be called self-assessment questions. True or false? A vegetarian diet cannot meet the protein requirements because plant protein is a poor quality protein. Now here the reason given is perfectly true. Plant protein is a poor quality protein. But still a vegetarian diet can meet the protein requirements because different proteins, plant proteins, are poor in different respects. So the deficiency of one can be made up by the other. So if we have a judicious combination of plant proteins, we can still get a good quality protein. And one judicious combination is the most time-honored combination is a cereal pulse combination. Sometimes, I talk about a story in relation to this. Many of you might remember there was a film a long time back called Dosti, Friendship. In this, the two friends, were handicapped in different ways. One could not see, and the other was lame. So the one who was lame took the support of the person who could not see to be able to walk properly. He would keep his hand on his shoulder. And the one who could not see knew which way to go because this person who could see, although he was lame, would be able to guide him safely. So it's something like that. The cereal and pulse proteins are like those two friends who may be both handicapped in their own way, but they're handicapped differently. And therefore, they can make up each other's handicap, and together they can function perfectly well. So therefore, the statement as a whole is false. Now, here's an assertion reason question, similar question. A cereal pulse combination cannot meet the protein requirements of a child. The reason given is the protein requirement of a child is greater than that of adults. The reason is perfectly true. A child, say a 10-kilo child we saw, needs 2 grams per kilogram body weight. An adult needs only 1 gram per kilogram body weight. So the protein requirement is greater than that of adults. And therefore, the person has asserted that a cereal pulse combination, which may meet the protein requirements of an adult, cannot meet the requirements of a child. But it can. Why? Because not only the protein requirement of a child is greater than that of adults, the energy requirement of children is also much greater than that of adults. And therefore, the percentage of energy required from proteins still remains the same. Okay. So assertion is a false statement because a cereal pulse combination can meet the protein requirements of a child. The reason is a true statement, that the protein requirement is greater. But then it is only part of the truth. The other part of the truth is that the energy requirement of a child is also greater than that of adults. Now here's a multiple choice question. To meet the protein requirements of an adult, dietary protein intake of 1 gram per kilogram body weight is neither necessary nor sufficient, necessary but not sufficient, both necessary and sufficient, sufficient but not necessary. The first one is wrong. Neither necessary nor sufficient. It is necessary, necessary but not sufficient. It is necessary and sufficient. So it is both necessary and sufficient. C is correct. Sufficient but not necessary. It is necessary. We do need that much protein. So the only correct statement, correct option is both necessary and sufficient. So 1 gram per kilogram body weight is necessary and also sufficient because we do not need any more. We do not need an excess. So the correct option is both necessary and sufficient. In order to get enough protein of good quality, the Indian diet should include milk, egg, and meat, a mixture of cereals and pulses if it is a vegetarian diet, a protein supplement if it is a vegetarian diet. Now, milk, egg, and meat, we do not need to get enough protein in an Indian diet. Pulses, we need, even if it's whether we're a vegetarian or non-vegetarian diet, we do not need pulses only if it is a vegetarian diet. A protein supplement if it is a vegetarian diet. Because when you say pulses, if it is a vegetarian diet, has that flavor that pulses will provide the protein, cereals will not. Cereals do, and quantitatively more than the pulses. And since there is no choice, if a person is a vegetarian, he should take a protein supplement, totally unnecessary. The supplement is totally unnecessary. So the correct alternative is B. In order to get enough protein of good quality, the Indian diet should include a mixture of cereals and pulses. In order to get enough protein of good quality, a child's diet must include milk and milk products, meat and fish, eggs, none of the above. Milk and milk products, you might say, well, a child diet must include. Yes, ideally, at the beginning of life, breast milk is the best food for the child. But if we were to talk about the children's diet in general, not just soon after birth, then milk and milk products are not necessary, because after breastfeeding, some people are not giving milk to their children anymore. Whether milk is desirable, undesirable, what is wrong with milk today, those are things which one can debate. But for various reasons, some people are depriving even their children of milk pretty early in life. Sometimes they are being forced to do it because the child has lactose intolerance or some other problem or milk allergy. But the fact is that a child can grow up quite satisfactorily even without milk and milk products. Now, I may digress a bit here on why milk is going into disfavor. Maybe we'll take it up again once more if there will be time. But why milk, which is a traditionally acceptable food in India and is considered vegetarian and so on, why that has come under so much fire recently? As Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya was saying the other day, these things vary with times. And when milk was considered a perfectly acceptable food, the times were very different. The person had a pet cow or one or two cows. Even a person who maintained a dairy had a small number of cows. And these cows, which the person had as pets, were treated more like a member of the family than like a machine that will provide milk which can be sold. They were treated as a part of the family. They were given love and affection. No effort was made to try extract more milk than is reasonable. Enough milk was left for the calf to feed on. And then a little milk was also taken out for human consumption. These days, on the other hand, what has happened is it has become an industry. A large number of cows are herded together in overcrowded places. They live in overcrowded conditions. They are given drugs to maximize the production of milk. The calf is deprived of the milk to the extent possible. And then as much milk is extracted as possible by using pumps if necessary. Now, that is a very different way of getting milk as compared to the earlier. And all the consciousness that goes into the milk probably will have effects on us. And therefore, well, there's one reason why the milk has come under fire. The second reason, again, which Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya hinted at the other day, was that we take pasteurized milk, and pasteurization means sudden heating and then sudden cooling. Heating to extremely high temperatures and then cooling suddenly, which means that a lot of dead germs are floating in the milk. And some of these, because they have the treatment they have received, might be broken into small enough bits to not need digestion. If they do not need digestion, which means that they have not been broken down completely into amino acids before they get into the blood. And therefore, they could have antigenic properties. And that is what could lead to various types of diseases, which we call allergies. And one of the consequences could be diabetes, because the antibodies produced may go and affect the pancreas. So that is how milk and diabetes have been linked. So these are some of the plausible mechanisms by which the type of milk that we get today may not be as safe as the type of milk which was considered perfectly acceptable as a vegetarian food once upon a time in India. So what is the solution? The solution is to try and go back as much as possible, treat the cow as the mother, as a mother, and take from it only as much milk as will be readily available with gratitude. So if that is the attitude, then milk has different qualities as compared to the industrialized and commercial approach to getting milk and milk products from animals. So in order to get enough protein of good quality, a child's diet must include milk and milk products. No, not absolutely essential. Meat and fish, not essential. Eggs, not essential. So the correct answer is none of the above. The suggested reading for this again is the same book, Eating Wisely and Well, and the title of the chapter is The Dethroned King. This is the place where I live and work, and now after the COVID restrictions have been lifted, we are open, so you're most welcome here, and you'll get a healthy vegetarian food. For any questions and comments, apart from those which may be asked now, you can always drop us an email. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for the opportunity, and thank you all for listening.
If there are any questions, if you want to unmute and ask, then you can do so right now.
May I, sir? So one small clarification. Hypothetically, if a family of 4 is living only on wheat and pulses, then are we saying 500 gram of cereal plus 100 gram of pulses per head per day? Would that? It's a very hypothetical question because obviously we will be taking other supplements and the other foods also.
Whereas, I mean, those calculations which I was mentioning were sort of partly for simplification, but they do have a realistic tinge to them. Because the exact requirement of each individual in the family will depend upon the height, body weight, gender, the amount of physical activity that the person is doing. So it will depend upon a lot of those things. And a cereal pulse mixture may meet much of the energy and protein requirements, but as we shall see in the subsequent talks, fruits and vegetables will also be important.
And sir, when we talk of calories, are we really saying calories or kilocalories? Is it a simplification?
That's a good question. In nutrition, when we talk of calories, it's kilocalories. All these are kilocalories. For those of you who may not be trained on science or who have forgotten, a kilocalorie, is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water through 1 degree centigrade. Whereas the ordinary calorie raises the temperature of 1 gram of water through 1 degree centigrade. For nutritional purposes, we use kilocalorie because if we talk in terms of the ordinary calorie, we will get very unwieldy figures.
There's a question in the chat box, how to give up non-veg food. I'm trying a lot, but after 2-3 months, again taking non-veg. Any method, please?
There can be 2 things I can think of. One is food is one of those things which is very difficult to give up attachment to. And if you have a particular liking for the taste of meat, maybe that's what it could be one of the factors that compels you to once again give up your resolve. There, soybean can come in handy because soybean has a type of composition which is somewhat like meat, and therefore it has a meaty taste. And those big blocks of soybean, which taste almost like blocks of meat, are also available. And not only that, the finely sort of minced type of soybean is also available, and that has been used, in fact, by the industry as a cheap meat expander. If they adulterate, so to say, some of the minced meat with those type of bits of soybean, people generally can't make out. So one is to sort of overcome sensory indulgence in general. I mean, that is a yogic discipline. But the other is, till you are ready for it, possibly soybean can be a good substitute.
In fact, that's the next question. Is soybean easy to digest? We Indians are not used to taking soybean.
Yes, but all the same, I mean, if there was any major difficulty in digesting soybean, we would have known it by now. Like many other proteins, the part that remains undigested would get fermented, could give some flatulence. So those things will be there, but that will depend partly on our digestive capacity, partly on the time when we take it. From 10 to 2 is the time when our digestive capacity is at its peak. So if it has been taken during that time, and the third most important thing perhaps is the quantity we have taken. So moderate quantity taken at the right time should probably not create any difficulties.
Sir, we have been depending a lot on cereals and pulses as major source of energy. It's fine, but at the same time, we are also seeing that the proportion of diabetics in Indian population has increased like anything, partly because of our poor lifestyle, partly because of overeating. But don't you think that the proportion of carbohydrates in our traditional food is far too in excess?
Well, that is again a misconception that the industry has succeeded in making us believe in. Diabetes is a multifactorial problem, and you in fact touched one of the most important things when you said that it is because of overeating. It is not because of what we eat, it is because we eat more than we need. Now, there are two ways of approaching that. One is we take very little exercise and we take very little food. The other is we take a reasonable amount of food and also take a reasonable amount of exercise. The second option is better. Eat well and exercise.
Yes.
And what will tell us that we are doing enough? To some extent, the body weight. So simple things, but at the same time, and again, I mean, I don't know what that book says, but then there are people coming up with these sane voices also. The other day, I picked up in Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya's slides, one little book. I think one can search on the internet what that book is about, the low carb fraud. This popularizing of low carbohydrate diets itself is a fraud, because if you take low carbohydrate, you'll either take low protein or you'll take, high protein or you'll take high fat. So that is how you can promote at least high protein diets, which means that you'll have to turn to protein supplements. So there's a whole book now, it seems, the low carb fraud. Once there was a patient that reminds me who once asked me, I have diabetes and my doctor says take a low carbohydrate diet. I also have heart disease and my doctor tells me take a low fat diet. I also have gout and that doctor tells me take a low protein diet. So low carbohydrate, low protein, low fat. What should I eat? Told him eat everything. Eat everything in moderation. Eat a proper balanced diet. That's all.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, doctor. I wanted to just talk about tofu, as in soybean, since you've mentioned it as one of the sources of protein, and we've discussed it in detail. But the notion is also that it is a genetically modified, product, and there is a lot of glyphosate residue that stays behind it. So overconsumption, and also with hormonal issues like PCOS, though there is phytoestrogens present, I understand, but then there is a concept of avoiding too much soya bean in hormonal issues and also from the perspective of genetically modified bean. So what would be your take on that?
Yes, that's a good question. And genetically modified foods, we don't always know which ones are and which ones are not. That also we don't always know. Soybean certainly has been associated, even if it's not genetically modified, with the phytochemicals which have a weak estrogenic effect, which means they could be undesirable, particularly in hormonal disorders, or they may be behind some of the, say, increase in the prevalence of things like polycystic ovarian disease. So yes, certainly, I mean, in those situations, it is it may be desirable to avoid such things. But then again, soybean is only one of the foods which has such a phytochemical. There are several other foods which also have phytochemicals with a weak estrogenic effect. So ultimately, it again comes down to lifestyle as a whole, which means that diet is only one of those factors. Take care of the others. And particularly when it comes to the mind, as we saw in Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya's session the other day, that if you have a sattvic tendency, maybe with some of the irregularities, which may be because of ignorance, or which may be because of the compulsions of modern life, or because you get only GMO foods of a certain, without even knowing that you're taking some GMO foods, genetically modified foods. So because of all these things, there will be many mistakes, but then you may be able to get away with them to quite some extent if otherwise one has a sattvic tendency. You eat with the right attitude.
Thank you, sir.
There are a few questions in the chat box. First is, the doctors recommend protein eggs during pregnancy. Is that required?
Yes, once again, the calculation is similar. A pregnant woman not only needs more protein, she also needs more energy, like a child. During pregnancy, say during the second trimester, she needs about 300 calories more than she did in the pre-pregnant state. And during lactation, 500 to 600 calories per day extra as compared to the pre-pregnant state. So if she takes this additional energy requirement in the form of a cereal pulse mixture, the protein requirement will take care of itself, even for the pregnant.
Milk is a veg food or a non-veg food?
And that, I think, to some extent, you may get clues from what I said some time back. It depends upon how you treat the cow.
Do we need to take dal every day?
Yes. No, but not necessarily at every meal. That's a good question, because while we need a cereal pulse mixture, it's not necessary that you should have it, say, if you have two major meals, then it's not necessary that you have it also at lunch and also at dinner. If you take enough of the dal to compensate for the cereal intake of two meals, you can take the dal only at one of the meals.
So I have another question, if I may ask. There is also a notion of, since the body is doing its repair and regenerative activities towards the night, so there's this new concept which is come up, which says that, include cereal pulse combination or high protein or good quality proteins in dinner, and include, carbs more during the day where you're more active, so that you're burning off those calories. So is it necessary, like in my house, we generally don't make dal at night. For us, dal, chawal, sabzi is for lunch and roti sabzi is for dinner. So is it necessary for us to include a protein source? I mean, of course, in the session, we've learned that carbohydrates also contribute towards proteins. So roti would also be contributing. But then is it important to have a cereal pulse combination for dinner to make up for the required protein, needs at night?
Well, I'm not sure if, although I mean, it seems logical, but I don't think it's really necessary that if one has to take pulses only once a day, it should be dinner rather than lunch, because at night body will be doing more of repair, etc. Because as you know, the amino acids are a pool floating in the blood, and in that pool, a few hours of difference probably will not make much difference to the amino acids that we are able to supply. But however, that does lead me to one or two other things. One is that the lunch should be heavier than dinner. That is axiomatic. That Ayurvedic wisdom insists on, and even modern science is on the whole in favor of. The second thing is that if we have to take, say, a dal both at lunch and dinner, then since the digestive capacity is stronger at lunch, probably that can be a unrefined dal, a whole dal, sabut dal, because that will be more difficult to digest. Whereas the one taken at dinner should be preferably a refined dal, a dhuli hui dal. So sabut moong at lunch, and if there is a dinner, probably dhuli hui moong. Or especially if it is a more difficult to digest dal, like rajma or chana or something, that should be at lunch, not at dinner.
Thank you, Dr. Bijlani.
Certain nutritionists advise a daily diet is based only fruits and vegetables and a bit of fats like natural coconut flakes, etc. No pulses or legumes. Is this advisable?
Well, these are all fad diets, and as we talked in the first session, in general, fad diets are bad diets.
As was mentioned that proteins can cause calcium deficiency, can that be related to a neck spasm?
And no, I don't think losing more calcium in the urine can be connected to the spasm of the neck muscles. That will be rather too far-fetched.
Then fasting sugar was considered safe up to 120. It became 110 and now 100. Is it another industry fraud?
Could be. The important thing is that instead of laying too much importance on giving too much importance to the exact figure, we try and see how we can keep it as low as possible. Because if a person say blood sugar is 120 and the person feels that, well, it is still borderline, instead of medication, let me try to correct it only with lifestyle modification, then that 120 becomes actually a trigger for that person to go in for a lifestyle modification. So one can take it as an opportunity rather than a debate whether 120 is still acceptable or not acceptable, because the label is not important. The important thing is that whether it is the old criteria or the new criteria, 120 is pretty high and it is borderline. Whether you consider it on this side of the border or that side of the border may change with times. There may be industry involved there in telling us whether it is this side of the border or that side of the border. But what is not debatable is that we should try to bring it down. And as you heard Dr. Vinay Simha the other day, that if a person is overweight, the simplest thing the person can do is to try and lose 5 or 10 kilos of weight. Even if the person does not come down to normal weight, that itself will bring down his blood glucose from 120 to maybe 100, fasting blood glucose. So concentrate on the lifestyle and instead of rushing to medication if it is borderline.
Do senior citizens or super senior citizens also require same amount of protein as a young person, quantity and quality?
Yes, that's a good question because it's possible that in the elderly, the digestion and absorption may not be as good as in youth. But then having said that, that applies not only to protein, it also applies to carbohydrate and fat. Not only that, it applies more to fat than to anything else, because throughout life, the nutrient that is digested the least easily is fat. That is where we have less of a reserve. For carbohydrates and proteins, we have plenty of reserve in the body, and therefore, even with a diminished reserve in old age, it is unlikely that most old people will require additional protein just because they cannot digest and absorb enough. So, but if person gets, say, big, heavy, greasy stools, then the person may feel that, yes, the fat that I could digest as a young person, probably now I can't. So the person can reduce the fat intake, or if that fat is also necessary, then distribute it between meals rather than take it in a single meal. So try and distribute the same amount of fat more equitably throughout the day in different meals.
Do diets specific to blood groups have any scientific validity?
Blood groups?
Diets specific to blood groups have any scientific validity?
At least no clear-cut, direct, and significant relationship. The only why I'm using all these guarded words is because you may say that, well, blood groups do have a certain relationship with peptic ulcer, and peptic ulcer may require a modification in diet. So therefore, those blood groups which are more vulnerable to peptic ulcer may require the type of modification that you need in peptic ulcer. But that will be a little too sort of twisted a logic, trying to arrive at too big a conclusion from very trifling facts. So that's why I would much rather not go for that type of a thing. Blood groups can be left aside while thinking of the diet. Prakriti, yes, one should think of. But now that takes me another question, whether Prakriti in any way is related to anything known to modern science. Now there is plenty of literature now on that the genetic makeup of a person, the genome, is related to the Prakriti of the person. We have studies. But then you may say that, so let us determine the genetic makeup and decide on the diet. But why do we have to do that? Because Prakriti can be determined so easily by using a questionnaire which costs you nothing. To get your genetic makeup determined in a laboratory may cost thousands of dollars. So why do you have to know that just because it is modern? Modern knowledge is helpful in validating it for those who are skeptical about ancient knowledge. But we don't have to determine our genome to decide our diet instead of using the Prakriti, which can be determined by just using a questionnaire.
I mean, that was related to the next word. Do epigenetics play any role in dietary intervention? So
yes, epigenetics are important because more and more we are realizing that apart from the genes, there are other influences which can be important and sometimes even override the influence of genes.
And how should we understand moderation in diet in view of insulin resistance?
Insulin resistance again is sort of a major contributor to diabetes. All diabetes, much of diabetes is not because of insulin deficiency, but quite a bit of it is because of the inability of the insulin to act. It's a resistance. There are studies which show some dietary modifications increase the sensitivity to insulin, which means that they bring down the insulin resistance. But those individual studies, I think, are not sorry, instead of looking at those individual studies, it may be better to look at it from a holistic angle, take a little broad view from a distance. And that again boils down to this basic thing that eat sensibly, eat enough, eat largely a plant-based diet, and then don't depend only also address other lifestyle factors. So when diet, particularly certain individual considerations in diet are only a small part of a much larger complex, to focus our attention on one or few minute details in the diet can not only be troublesome because it will give us unnecessary stress, because you'll be all the time thinking whether I'm doing the right thing or not. Instead of that, take a little broader view from a distance and just eat what seems to be a sensible diet and take care of the other lifestyle factors also. All this will become more and about the diet part become more and more clear as we go to the other subsequent sessions, and finally there will be a session also on balanced diets, and then other lifestyle factors will come in the subsequent modules, yes.03 and yes.04.
That brings us to the end of session for today. And tomorrow we will have the next practical class for standing postures. So thank you everyone for joining in today. We end with the music.